I sat there in total silence for 2 hours, watching my brother act like a king who had already secured his crown. He looked the room dead in the eye and said that everything was his. That was the exact second I slid the folder Grandpa had signed onto the table. Watching the light die in his eyes was worth every single second of the wait. My name is Brielle Harper. I am 34 years old, and if there is one thing I have learned in 3 decades of living in this family, it is that silence is often the loudest thing in the room. I sat in the high-backed leather chair, the kind that swivels with a heavy, expensive silence, and kept my hands folded in my lap. The conference room of the law firm was aggressively tasteful. It smelled of lemon polish and old paper, a scent designed to remind you that serious things happened here, things that cost hundreds of dollars an hour to discuss. The walls were lined with books that no one ever read, bound in colors that ranged from dark forest green to deep maroon. In the center of the room dominated a mahogany table so long it felt less like furniture and more like a landing strip. My mother, Diane, was already seated. She sat 2 seats down from the head of the table, her posture rigid, her fingers twisting the gold band on her ring finger. She did not look at me. She had greeted me with a tight, obligatory nod when we arrived in the lobby 10 minutes ago, a nod that said she was tolerating my presence rather than welcoming it. She was checking the time on her phone for the 3rd time in 60 seconds. She was waiting for the main event. She was waiting for her sun, her moon, and her stars. I was sitting in the corner, closest to the heavy oak door. This was my designated spot in the family geography. At Thanksgiving, I was at the end of the table near the kitchen so I could help clear the plates. At Christmas, I was on the ottoman because the sofa was for the adults, even though I had been paying my own taxes for 12 years. And here, at the reading of my grandfather's estate, I was placed near the exit, as if the universe, or at least my mother, expected me to be the first one to be dismissed. The heavy door swung open, and the air in the room seemed to shift, sucked toward the vacuum of charisma that was my brother. Colton Harper walked in. He was 38 years old, but he carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who had been told he was a king since the day he took his first breath. He was wearing a navy suit that I knew cost more than $4,000 because he had bragged about the tailor in downtown Chicago the last time we spoke. His hair was perfectly gelled, not a strand out of place, and he held a leather portfolio under his arm like a weapon. Clinging to his bicep was Kendra, his wife. She was dressed in a shade of cream that was impractical for real life, but perfect for signaling status. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning the bookshelves and the view of the city skyline through the window, calculating the net worth of the firm before her gaze finally landed on me. It was a look of mild surprise, as if she had forgotten I existed until that very second. "Sorry we're late," Colton said, his voice booming. He didn't sound sorry. He sounded like he was doing us a favor by arriving at all. Traffic on the interstate was a nightmare. Someone rear-ended a sedan near the exit. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table. Not the lawyer's chair, but the one directly opposite it, the power seat. He sat down and exhaled loudly, placing his portfolio on the table with a heavy thud. It was a sound of ownership. "Hi, Mom," he said, flashing that smile that had gotten him out of detention in high school and into country clubs in his 30s. "Colton, honey," Mom said, her voice instantly softening, losing the brittle edge it held when she spoke to me. "You look tired. Are you working too hard?" "You know how it is," Colton said, winking at her. "Building the empire isn't a 9-to-5 job." He finally turned his head toward the corner, toward me. "Hey, Brielle," he said. His tone was breezy, dismissive. "Didn't think you'd make it. Figured you'd be off filming a cat video or something." "It's good to see you." "Colton," I said. My voice was steady. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him that my last project was a documentary on urban housing reform that had just been picked up by a streaming service. I didn't tell him that I had been up until 3 a.m. finishing an edit for a client in London. To Colton, and by extension to my mother. I was just Brielle who played with cameras. I was the freelancer, the drifter, The one who didn't have a corner office or a title that sounded impressive at cocktail parties. "Well," Colton said, checking his watch, a heavy platinum thing that caught the light. "Let's get this show on the road. I have a tea time at 4:00. He looked at the empty chair at the very head of the table. "Where is Mitchell? I thought these guys charged by the minute." "Mr. Hart will be here shortly," I said. Colton raised an eyebrow. "You've talked to him?" "I arrived on time," I said simply. His assistant said he was gathering the final files. Colton let out a short, sharp laugh. He turned to Kendra. "She arrived on time. Of course she did. Nothing else to do, right?" Kendra giggled. It was a practice sound, light and airy. "Be nice. Colt. Brielle is artistic. Artists have their own schedules." I looked down at my hands. I was not angry. Years ago, this would have made my blood boil. I would have snapped back. I would have listed my achievements. I would have begged for their validation. But today, the anger was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, hard resolve. It felt like a stone in my stomach, heavy and grounding. I reached down and touched the tote bag resting against the leg of my chair. Inside, tucked away in the back pocket, was a thick manila envelope. It was sealed. I could feel the outline of the papers inside through the canvas of my bag. That envelope contained the last 6 months of my life. It contained the truth about the leaky roofs I had fixed. It contained the logs of every conversation I had with the tenants in the buildings Colton claimed to manage. It contained the receipts for the plumber I had paid out of my own savings because Colton wouldn't answer his phone. And most importantly, it contained a document signed by Grandpa Warren 3 weeks before he died, witnessed by 2 nurses and a notary who had no connection to this family. But I did not pull it out, not yet. Colton was currently arranging his papers on the table. He had a notepad, a pen, and a spreadsheet that I could see was color-coded. He looked professional. He looked like the executor. He looked like the hero of the story he had been telling himself for his entire life. "I took the liberty of drafting a tentative plan for the liquidation of the properties," Colton said, addressing Mom. He ignored me completely. "The market is hot right now. If we offload the apartment complex on 4th Street by the end of the quarter, we can minimize the capital gains tax. I have a buyer lined up, a developer from the city. They want to tear it down and build condos." "Tear it down?" Mom asked, blinking. "But your grandfather built that place. He laid the bricks himself for the foundation." Colton waved his hand dismissively. "Sentimentality doesn't pay the bills. Mom, Grandpa was a great man, but he was old-fashioned. He was renting those units out for 40% below market value. It's bleeding money. I'm going to stop the bleeding." "You're so smart." "Colton," Mom said, a look of adoration washing over her face. "Grandpa always said you had a head for business." I bit the inside of my cheek. Grandpa had said Colton had a head for profit, not business. There was a difference. Grandpa had told me that business was about people, and profit was about numbers. He said if you focused on the people, the numbers would come. If you focused on the numbers, the people would leave. Colton had never understood that. "What about the tenants?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the air. Colton stopped shuffling his papers. He looked at me with genuine annoyance. "What about them?" "Some of them have lived there for 20 years, I said. "Mrs. Higgins in Unit 2B is 80 years old. Where is she going to go if a developer tears the building down?" Colton sighed, the kind of exaggerated sigh one uses with a slow child. "Brielle, this is exactly why you aren't involved in the finances. This is business. Mrs. Higgins will get her notice, and she will find another place. That is how the world works. We aren't running a charity here." "Grandpa ran it like a charity sometimes," I countered. "And that is why the estate isn't worth half of what it should be," Colton snapped. "Look, don't worry about it. I'll handle the heavy lifting. You just worry about whatever it is you do, editing, filming weddings, you'll get your check. Brielle, I'll make sure you get a nice little slice of the pie, enough to buy a new camera or go on a trip to Europe. Just let the adults handle the real assets." Kendra reached out and patted Colton's arm. "He's just trying to protect you. Brielle, managing property is stressful. You don't want those wrinkles." I looked at them, the golden child and his perfect wife, my mother, the enabler, nodding along, relieved that her son was taking charge, relieved that she wouldn't have to think about the complexities of her father's legacy. They were so sure. They were so incredibly, arrogantly sure of how this day was going to go. They thought they were here to divide the spoils of a war they hadn't fought. They thought I was here to beg for scraps. The door to the inner office opened, and Mitchell Hart stepped out. He was a man of 72 years, with gray hair that had thinned to a wisp and eyes that had seen everything people did to each other in the name of money. He carried a single, slim file folder. He didn't look at Colton. He didn't look at Mom. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, a microscopic acknowledgement, before he walked to the head of the table. "Good afternoon," Mitchell said. His voice was like dry paper. "Mitchell," Colton said, standing up to shake his hand. "Good to see you. Let's get this wrapped up, shall we? I've got that tea time." Mitchell didn't shake Colton's hand. He gestured for him to sit down. "Please, take a seat. Mr. Harper." Colton paused, his hand hovering in the air, before he pulled it back and sat down, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Right. Well, I've brought my own projections for the estate's value, if you want to compare notes." Mitchell sat down slowly. He placed his folder on the table. He clasped his hands together. "We are here to execute the last will and testament of Warren Harper," Mitchell said. "And to transfer the executorship to me," Colton interrupted, "as we discussed last year when Grandpa got sick." Mitchell turned his head slowly to look at Colton. "We did not discuss that. Mr. Harper, you spoke. I listened." "Same thing," Colton said with a laugh. He looked around the room, seeking validation. "I'm the only one qualified. Mom doesn't want the stress. And Brielle? Well, Brielle is Brielle." My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my face remained a mask of calm. This was it. The moment was approaching. I could feel the envelope in my bag practically vibrating. I wanted to pull it out. I wanted to slam the evidence of his neglect and my diligence onto the table right now. I wanted to show them the photos of the mold I cleaned while Colton was golfing. I wanted to show them the text messages where Colton called Grandpa a senile old bat, while I was holding Grandpa's hand in the hospital. But I stopped myself. If I did it now, it would just be an argument. It would be a sister fighting with a brother. It would be emotional Brielle causing a scene. No. I needed more. I needed him to commit. I needed him to stand on top of the mountain and claim it as his own, so that when the ground crumbled beneath him, the fall would be fatal. I looked at Colton. He was leaning forward, his eyes bright with greed. He looked like a predator who had cornered his prey. "Everything is set up," Colton said, tapping his finger on his spreadsheet. "I'm ready to sign whatever needs signing, the accounts, the deeds, the titles. Bring it on. I'm ready to take it all on." He paused, then looked at me with a smirk that was equal parts pity and triumph. "You don't have to worry about a thing, little sister," he said. "I've got this. Everything is mine to handle now." There it was. I took a slow breath, inhaling the scent of lemon polish and impending justice. "Everything is yours?" I asked softly. "Everything," Colton said. "The burden and the glory." "I want to be clear," I said, my voice rising just enough to carry the weight of the moment. "You are claiming full responsibility? You are saying that you are the one who has been managing Grandpa's affairs? That you are the one who knows this estate inside and out?" 100%, Colton said. He looked at Mitchell. "Can we move on? She's just anxious about her allowance." I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who had just watched the trap snap shut. "Okay," I whispered to myself. I reached into my bag. My fingers closed around the thick, cool paper of the envelope. I want to hear him say, "Everything is mine," first. I thought, the words echoing in my head like a mantra. Because only then will it hurt enough. And he had said it. I pulled the envelope out and placed it gently on the table. The sound it made was soft, like a whisper. But in the silence of that room, it sounded like a gunshot. To understand why the silence in that conference room was so heavy, you have to rewind 6 months. You have to go back to the day the word cancer stopped being a zodiac sign and became a countdown. Grandpa Warren Harper was 82 years old when the doctors told us his lungs were failing. It was stage 4. There was no stage 5. When the news broke, it acted like a chemical agent dropped into a solution, separating the mixture of our family into its purest, most volatile elements. For me, the diagnosis was a shattering of my world. Grandpa was the only person who had ever looked at me and seen a person rather than a disappointment. But for my mother and Colton, the diagnosis was a starting gun. Grandpa Warren was not just an old man dying in a hospice bed. He was an entity, over 50 years. He had built a portfolio of real estate that was staggering in its quiet scope. He owned 12 duplexes in the University District, 3 commercial strip malls on the west side, and a mid-rise apartment building that had been fully occupied since 1998. The cash flow from his assets was the kind of steady, rhythmic pulse that banks loved and greedy relatives dreamed about. Before the sickness, Colton visited Grandpa perhaps once a month. He would swing by in his leased BMW, spend 15 minutes talking about his own job, check his watch, and leave. But the moment the oncologist gave us a timeline of 6 months, Colton became the most devoted grandson in the history of the state. Or at least, he tried to look like one. I remember standing in the hospital corridor a week after the diagnosis. The air smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. I had just spent the night in the chair next to Grandpa's bed, because he was terrified of waking up alone in the dark. Colton walked in, fresh from a shower, smelling of expensive cologne and ambition. He stopped me before I could go get a cup of tea. "You look like hell, Brielle," he said, not unkindly, but with that patronizing tilt of his head. "You should go home, sleep. I'll take a shift." "I'm fine," I said. He likes it when I read the morning paper to him. Colton sighed and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Look, I know you are emotional. That is your nature. But we need to be practical now. There are things that need to be managed. Assets, accounts, tenants. This isn't just about holding hands. Brielle, it is about protecting the legacy." "I am protecting him," I said, stepping out from under his hand. "You are making him comfortable," Colton corrected. "I am protecting what he built. You don't have the head for this. Brielle, you are too soft. You let people walk all over you. If you tried to manage his tenants, they would stop paying rent in a week. Leave the heavy lifting to someone with financial experience." He walked into the room, and I heard his voice switch instantly to a loud, cheerful boom. "Hey there, champ! Ready to talk about those quarterly tax filings?" My mother, Diane, was no better. In fact, she was the PR machine for Colton's hostile takeover at Sunday dinners, which suddenly had full attendance. She would hold court while stirring the gravy. "It is such a relief that Colton is stepping up," she would say to my aunts and uncles, loudly enough for me to hear from the sink where I was washing dishes. "Dad has so many complicated holdings. Thank God Colton understands the market. Brielle is sweet, of course, but she is still finding herself. She is still loi hoi." Loi hoi, struggling, that was her word for me, because I didn't have a corporate salary or a mortgage on a McMansion. I was permanently a child in her eyes. It didn't matter that I paid my own rent or that my clients respected me. To Diane, net worth was the only measure of adulthood. I didn't argue with them. I didn't have the energy to fight a war on 2 fronts. I poured all my energy into the time I had left with Grandpa. I started going to his house every single day, not to talk about the will, but to listen. Grandpa Warren was a man who had built his empire with calloused hands. He wasn't a suit. He was a worker. As the cancer ate away at his body, his mind seemed to travel back to the beginning. He told me stories I had never heard. He told me about buying his first duplex in 1972. He told me how he couldn't afford a plumber, so he bought a book at the library and learned how to sweat copper pipes himself. He told me about the winter of 1985, when the boiler blew in the apartment building on Christmas Eve. He didn't call a contractor. He drove his truck down there, put on his coveralls, and spent the entire night in the basement with a wrench and a flashlight so his tenants wouldn't freeze. "You have to respect the building, Bree," he told me one afternoon. His voice was raspy, a sound like dry leaves scraping together. "A house isn't just wood and brick, it is a shell for people's lives. If you take care of the shell, the people will take care of you. If you just squeeze it for cash, it will crumble." He looked at me with watery blue eyes. "Colton doesn't understand that. He thinks real estate is a spreadsheet." I squeezed his hand. It felt frail, the skin like parchment paper over bone. "He just wants to make sure everything is organized. Grandpa?" Grandpa let out a huff that turned into a cough. "He comes in here, and he doesn't ask how I'm sleeping. He asks where the deeds are kept. He asks if I have updated the depreciation schedule. He asks about the capital gains threshold." I stayed silent. I knew it was true. I had seen Colton sitting by the bed, not looking at Grandpa, but typing furiously on his laptop, asking questions like an auditor conducting a raid. "So, if we transfer the title before the fiscal year ends, does that bypass the probate limit? Where are the keys to the commercial units? I need to assess the current market value. Have you considered liquidating the older properties? The maintenance costs are eating into the margins." It was predatory. It was essentially an inventory check on a store that hadn't closed yet. One rainy Tuesday in November, things changed. I was sitting in the armchair in Grandpa's study, sorting through a box of old photographs for him. He was having a good day, sitting up in his wheelchair, looking out the window at the gray sky. Colton had just left. He had been there for 20 minutes, loud and imposing, demanding access to Grandpa's online banking passwords for safekeeping. Grandpa had feigned fatigue and asked him to leave. The room was quiet now, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "Brielle," Grandpa said. I looked up. "Do you need water?" "No," he said. "Come here." I pulled my chair closer. He took my hand in both of his. His grip was surprisingly strong, a flash of the strength that used to be there. "Your brother," he said, staring intensely into my eyes. "He doesn't love the houses. He doesn't care about the families living in them. He loves the money. That is all he sees. He sees dollar signs where I see people." "I know," I whispered. "Your mother thinks he is the second coming," Grandpa continued. "She thinks because he wears a tie and talks loud. He is a leader. But he is not a leader. He is a butcher. If I give him this estate, he will gut it. He will sell it off piece by piece to the highest bidder, kick out the families, and buy himself a bigger boat." He paused to catch his breath, his chest heaving under his flannel shirt. "I worked too hard for 50 years to let a man in a shiny suit destroy it just because he shares my last name," Grandpa said. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The air in the room felt suddenly charged, electric. "You need to prepare yourself, Brielle." "Prepare for what?" I asked. "For the explosion," he said. A small, mischievous smile touched his pale lips. It was the first time I had seen him smile in weeks. "I am going to do something that will make them so angry they won't be able to see straight. But I need to know if you are brave enough." "Brave enough for what?" "To be the villain in their story," he said. "Because that is what they will call you. When they find out what we are going to do, they will hate you. They will say you stole it. They will say you manipulated a dying old man." He squeezed my hand tighter. "But I need to know if you have the stomach for it. Can you stand in a room with them and hold your ground when they are screaming at you?" I thought about the years of being the helper. I thought about the table at Thanksgiving where I sat near the kitchen. I thought about Colton's condescending pat on my shoulder and my mother's disappointed sighs. I thought about the tenants Grandpa had told me about, the single mothers, the retirees, the people whose homes were just lines on Colton's spreadsheet. I looked at my grandfather. I saw the fire in his eyes. He wasn't asking me to steal. He was asking me to protect. "I can do it," I said. "Good," Grandpa said. He let go of my hand and pointed to the bottom drawer of his heavy oak desk. "Open that drawer. There is a blue notebook inside. 200 pages, handwritten. I walked over and opened the drawer. There it was, a battered blue notebook with a spiral binding. "That is your education," Grandpa said. "Colton went to business school. You are going to go to Warren Harper's School of Property Management. Start reading. We have a lot of work to do, and we don't have much time." That was the moment the balance of power shifted, though nobody else knew it yet. While Colton was out playing golf and bragging about his future inheritance, I sat in that study, day after day, learning the difference between a fuse box and a circuit breaker, learning the names of every tenant, and learning exactly how to build a fortress that my brother could not knock down. The family thought I was just the dutiful granddaughter, keeping the death watch. They had no idea I was being weaponized. The weeks that followed were a blur of exhaust fumes, damp basements, and the scratching of a ballpoint pen on paper. My grandfather, despite the oxygen tank tethering him to his favorite armchair like a diver to a boat, became the most demanding professor I had ever encountered. He called it the Harper Field Guide, but to me, it felt more like an induction into a secret society. The blue notebook became an extension of my arm. It was not a digital file. It was analog, messy, and real. It smelled of the peppermint candies Grandpa sucked on to mask the metallic taste of his medication. "Go to the duplex on Elm Street," he would wheeze, pointing a trembling finger at the page I had opened. "The downstairs unit. Talk to Mr. Alvarez. Ask him if the radiator in the back bedroom is still clanking like a bag of hammers. If it is, you call Mike the plumber, not the agency. The agency charges double and sends a kid who doesn't know a wrench from a ratchet." I would drive to Elm Street. I would knock on the door, feeling like an imposter, but then Mr. Alvarez would open it, his face wary until I mentioned Warren sent me. "Warren?" His face would soften instantly. "How is the old boss? Is he eating? Tell him the radiator is fine. I bled the valve myself, just like he showed me 10 years ago." I wrote it all down. Alvarez, Unit 1A, radiator fixed by tenant. Send thank you note or fruit basket. When I reported back, Grandpa would nod, satisfied. "Good. Alvarez is a good man. He was late on rent 3 times in 1999 because his wife was sick. I let it slide. He has never been late since. That is the return on investment Colton doesn't see." This became our routine. While my mother was busy planning the funeral playlist and Colton was researching estate tax loopholes, I was learning the anatomy of the buildings. I learned that the roof on the strip mall on 4th Avenue needed to be cleared of snow immediately after a storm because the drainage was poor in the northeast corner. I learned that the commercial oven in the bakery Grandpa owned was leased, not owned, and the lease was up in November. I learned the names. There was Sarah, the single mother in the apartment complex who worked double shifts at the diner. Grandpa told me, "She pays on the 5th of the month, never the 1st. Don't chase her. Her paycheck clears on the 4th. If you pressure her on the 2nd, you lose a tenant who treats that apartment like gold." I wrote it down. Sarah, due date is the 5th. Do not send late notice. Colton, meanwhile, was operating in a parallel universe. He would breeze into the house in the evenings, loosening his tie, looking the part of the weary executive. He never asked about the buildings. He asked about the ledgers. "Did you find the deeds for the commercial lots?" he asked one Tuesday, ignoring the fact that Grandpa was mid-cough. "I need to run a valuation. I think the insurance premiums are too high. We could probably cut costs by switching to a high-deductible plan." I was sitting in the corner, my notebook on my lap. I knew that switching to a high-deductible plan would be a disaster, because 3 of those buildings had original plumbing that was a ticking time bomb. But I said nothing. "The deeds are in the safe, Colton," Grandpa said, his voice weak. "But you are missing the point. You can't insure against bad will." Right. Colton dismissed him, tapping away on his phone. "I'll get the key from Mom later." It was during these interactions that a slow, cold realization began to dawn on me. For my entire life, I had been told I was the creative one, the soft one, the one who wasn't cut out for the hard realities of business. I had believed it. I had let them convince me that because I couldn't recite the tax code, I was incompetent. But as I sat there, listening to Colton propose cutting the landscaping budget for the senior living triplex to save $1,200 a year, I realized he was the incompetent one. He didn't know that the landscaping was the only reason Mrs. Gable stayed. He didn't understand that the wasteful maintenance costs were actually customer retention strategies. I wasn't bad at business. I just had a different currency. One afternoon, about 3 weeks before the end, Grandpa handed me a heavy metal ring. It was jammed with keys, maybe 30 of them, jangling together with a chaotic music. "These are the masters," he said. "The spares. Every landlord needs a set that never leaves their sight." "Shouldn't Colton have these?" I asked, testing him. "He is the executor, isn't he?" Grandpa looked at me with a clarity that cut through the morphine haze. "A key is a symbol of access. Brielle, Colton wants access to the bank accounts. You need access to the homes. Keep them. Hide them. If something happens to a tenant at 2 a.m, I don't want them calling a call center. I want them calling someone who knows which key opens the door." I took the heavy ring. It felt cold and substantial in my palm. It felt like a weapon and a shield all at once. I put them in the bottom of my camera bag, buried under lenses and memory cards. The tension in the house was ratcheting up. You could feel it in the way my mother hovered, asking leading questions about finalizing affairs. You could feel it in the way Colton started showing up at odd hours, when he thought I wasn't there. That was how I caught him. I had come back early from a field trip to the hardware store. Grandpa wanted me to check the price of bulk air filters. I walked into the house quietly, wearing my sneakers. The door to Grandpa's study was ajar. Grandpa was asleep in his bedroom down the hall. The study should have been empty. I peered through the crack in the door. Colton was there. He was standing at Grandpa's desk. He had pulled a stack of file folders out of the filing cabinet, the one Grandpa usually kept locked, but the key was in the porcelain bowl on the shelf. Colton wasn't reading the files. He was photographing them. He had his smartphone out, holding it steady over a document. Click. He flipped the page. Click. He flipped again. Click. His face was twisted in a look of intense concentration, but there was something else there too. Greed? Panic? It was hard to tell. He was moving fast, like a thief who knows the security guard is on rounds. I saw the header of the document he was photographing. It was the deed to the lakefront property, the jewel of the portfolio. My first instinct was to burst in. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout. "What are you doing? He isn't even dead yet." I wanted to drag him by his expensive Italian lapels and throw him out of the house. But then I remembered Grandpa's voice. "Can you stand in a room with them and hold your ground?" If I confronted him now, he would spin it. He would say he was organizing. He would say he was digitizing records for safekeeping. My mother would believe him. She would say I was being hysterical, that I was causing drama in a time of grief. He would lock me out. He would hide the files better. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I stayed silent. I watched him photograph 3 more documents. I watched him slide the files back into the cabinet. And this is how I knew he didn't care, he put them back in the wrong order. He didn't respect the system. He just wanted the data. I stepped back, turned around, and walked silently to the kitchen. I opened the fridge and closed it loud enough to make a noise. "Hello?" Colton called out from the study, his voice pitching up slightly. "It is just me," I yelled back. "Getting some juice." Colton walked into the kitchen 10 seconds later. He looked flushed. "Hey, didn't hear you pull up." "I parked on the street," I said, pouring a glass of orange juice with a steady hand. "Grandpa is sleeping?" "Yeah," Colton said. "I was just checking on the thermostat in the study. It felt a little cold." "That is thoughtful of you," I said. I looked him dead in the eye and smiled. It was a pleasant, sisterly smile. "You are really stepping up. Colton." He relaxed. He bought it. He thought I was the same dumb little sister who didn't notice when he cheated at Monopoly 20 years ago. "Someone has to," he said, puffing out his chest. I went back to Grandpa that evening. He was awake, staring at the ceiling. I sat down beside him and opened the blue notebook. "I went to the hardware store," I said. "The filters are $12 a box if we buy in bulk." "Good," Grandpa whispered. "Write it down." I hesitated. "Grandpa, Colton was in here earlier." He moved his head to look at me. "I know. I heard him rummaging around like a rat in a trash can." "He was taking photos of the deeds," I said. Grandpa closed his eyes. A look of profound sadness washed over his face, but it was followed by a steeliness that matched the gray of his hair. "Let him," Grandpa said. "Let him take pictures of the paper. He thinks the power is in the paper. He thinks if he holds the deed, he owns the kingdom." He reached out and tapped the blue notebook on my lap. "The power isn't in the paper, Brielle. It is in the knowledge. It is in the relationships. He is capturing shadows." He took a ragged breath. "One day, very soon, you will have to prove something to them. You will have to prove that love is also a competence, that caring isn't a weakness. It is an operational strategy. Can you do that?" "I can," I said, and for the first time, I wasn't just saying it to comfort him, I felt it. I had the keys, I had the notebook, and I knew exactly who the enemy was. They thought they were waiting for an inheritance. They didn't realize they were walking into a performance review, and I was the auditor. It was 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night when the war officially moved from the trenches to the command center. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic chugging of the oxygen concentrator, a sound that had become the background track to our lives. I was in the kitchen, rinsing out a mug, when Grandpa called my name. It was not a weak, sickbed call. It was a summons. I dried my hands and walked into the bedroom. He was sitting up, propped against 3 pillows. The reading lamp cast long, sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the hollows of his cheeks, but also the fierce, undimmed brightness of his eyes. "Close the door," he said. "Lock it." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I did as he asked, the click of the lock sounding unnaturally loud in the silent house. I pulled the chair up to his bedside. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Are you in pain?" "I am in clarity," he said. He pointed to a spot on the duvet. "Sit. We need to talk about the endgame." I sat down, my hands clasping together in my lap. I assumed he wanted to go over the funeral arrangements again. We had discussed hymns and flowers, but he was particular about the wood of the casket. "I have made a decision," Grandpa said. His voice was steady, devoid of the wheeze that usually plagued him. "I am going to transfer the entire portfolio, every title, every deed, the commercial lots, the residential blocks, the land in the county, all of it." My stomach dropped. I looked down at my knees. I had known this was coming. Of course. Colton had been pushing for it for months, talking about asset protection and continuity of management. I had just hoped Grandpa would hold out a little longer. I had hoped he wouldn't sign his life's work over to a man who viewed it as a piggy bank while he was still breathing. "Okay," I said, my voice small. "Do you want me to call Colton? He can bring the papers over tomorrow morning. He has them ready. He is always ready." Grandpa looked at me for a long moment. "Why would I call Colton?" I blinked. To sign it over to him. He is the executor. He is the business one." "I am not giving it to Colton," Grandpa said. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "What?" I asked. "I am transferring it to you," he said. I stared at him. The words didn't make sense. It was like he had spoken in a language I didn't speak. Me? Brielle the freelancer? Brielle the one who sat in the corner? "Grandpa." "No," I said, panic rising in my throat like bile. You can't do that." "Why not?" "Because it will destroy everything." I stood up, my hands shaking. "Colton will go nuclear. Mom will never forgive me. They will tear this family apart. I can't fight them. Grandpa, I am not a fighter. I am just me. If you give me the houses, you are declaring war." Grandpa reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was iron. He pulled me back down into the chair. "Listen to me," he hissed. "The war didn't start today. The war started 5 years ago when your brother stopped seeing me as a grandfather and started seeing me as a liquidity event. The war started when your mother decided that your worth was tied to your salary. They declared war on this family a long time ago. Brielle, you were just too busy trying to keep the peace to notice that they were shelling your position. I stared at him, tears stinging my eyes. But if you do this, they will hate me. They will respect you, he said firmly. Or they will fear you. At this point, I don't care which. I only care about the tenants. I only care that Mrs. Higgins doesn't get evicted so Colton can buy a Porsche. You are the only one who will protect them. He let go of my wrist. Now, wipe your face. Mitchell is coming tomorrow at 9 in the morning. Colton is playing golf. I checked his calendar. Mitchell? I asked. Mr. Hart? He is the only lawyer in this town I trust, Grandpa said. He was my friend before I had a dime. He isn't one of those corporate sharks Colton hires. Mitchell knows where the bodies are buried because he helped me dig the holes. The next morning, the house transformed into a fortress of legal precision. Mitchell Hart arrived exactly at 9. He was a man who looked like he was carved out of granite. Gray suit, gray hair, gray eyes. He didn't carry a briefcase. He carried a secure lockbox. He wasn't alone. He brought 2 other people with him. One was Dr. Evans, a neurologist who had treated Grandpa for years but had no social connection to our family. The other was a woman I didn't know, a court-certified videographer with a tripod and a serious expression. Brielle, Mitchell said, nodding to me as he entered. He didn't smile. This wasn't a social call. Please ensure the doors are locked and the curtains in the study are drawn. We need a controlled environment. We gathered in the study. The atmosphere was surgical. There was no emotion, only procedure. First, Dr. Evans conducted a full evaluation. He sat with Grandpa for 45 minutes, asking him questions that ranged from the current president to the specific details of his medication, to the logic behind his financial decisions. He recorded everything. Patient is fully oriented, Dr. Evans said to the camera, which was now blinking with a red recording light. He is lucid, sharp, and demonstrating 0 signs of cognitive decline or coercion. Then, Mitchell opened the lockbox. He laid out the documents. There were stacks of them. These weren't just a will. A will is a wish. A will can be contested. These were immediate transfers. These were trust documents. These were irrevocable deeds moving the ownership of the Harper estate into a trust structure where I was the sole trustee and beneficiary, effective immediately upon signature. This is the nuclear option, Mitchell said, sliding a heavy fountain pen across the mahogany desk toward Grandpa. Once you sign these, Warren, the assets are gone. They are hers. If you change your mind next week, you cannot get them back. Colton cannot claim they are part of the probate estate because they won't belong to you anymore. I won't change my mind, Grandpa said. He looked at the camera. He looked straight into the lens, as if he were staring directly into Colton's eyes from the future. I, Warren Harper, being of sound mind and body, am making these transfers of my own free will, he said, his voice strong and resonant. I am choosing Brielle Harper as my successor, because she is the only one who understands the business. My grandson, Colton, believes business is about extraction. I believe it is about stewardship. That is why he gets nothing. The room was silent except for the scratching of the pen. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Every signature felt like a physical blow. I stood in the corner, watching. I felt nauseous. I knew that with every stroke of ink, Grandpa was severing the cord that held our family together. He was cutting me loose from the safety of being the good, quiet daughter and casting me out into the storm. When he finished, Mitchell turned the papers to me. Your turn, Brielle, he said. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady them. I can't, I whispered. You can, Grandpa said. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with expectation. You already did the work. You learned the notebook. This is just the paperwork. I took the pen. It was warm from his hand. I thought about Colton laughing at my camera gear. I thought about my mother telling me to sit at the kids' table. I thought about the way they looked at Grandpa, not as a man, but as a bank vault with a slow timer. I signed. My signature looked jagged, nervous, but it was there. Brielle Harper. Mitchell gathered the papers with the speed and efficiency of a card dealer. He stamped them. The notary he had brought in, a third witness I hadn't even noticed standing by the door, stamped them. "It is done," Mitchell said. He looked at his watch. "I will file these with the county clerk today. However, I will put a seal on the digital record for 48 hours. It is a small favor I can call in. It will keep Colton from seeing the update on the online portal until it is too late." "Good," Grandpa said. He slumped back in his chair, suddenly looking very old and very tired. The adrenaline was fading. Mitchell packed up his lockbox. The videographer collapsed her tripod. Dr. Evans made a final note in his chart. Before Mitchell left, Grandpa stopped him. "The letter?" Grandpa said. Mitchell reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with wax, old-fashioned, dramatic, and exactly Grandpa's style. "I have it," Mitchell said. "Brielle," Grandpa said, turning his head to me. "This letter is the final nail. Mitchell is to keep it. It is not to be opened until the family meeting. Not a moment before." "What is in it?" I asked. "The truth," Grandpa said, "and a specific instruction for Mitchell. If Colton tries to fight this, if he tries to drag you into court, or claims I was senile, or tries to use his connections to freeze the assets, Mitchell is to read this letter out loud." "And if he accepts it?" I asked, though I knew he wouldn't. "He won't," Grandpa said. "But if by some miracle he acts like a human being, the letter stays sealed. But he is Colton. He will scream, and when he screams, this letter will silence him." Mitchell nodded. "I will guard it with my life, Warren." They left as quickly and quietly as they had arrived. The house returned to silence. I stood in the study, surrounded by the ghosts of the morning. The desk was empty. The papers were gone. I looked at Grandpa. He was asleep in his chair, his chest rising and falling with a shallow rhythm. He looked peaceful, for the first time in months. The lines of tension around his eyes were gone. I walked over and covered him with a blanket. I realized then that I wasn't just his granddaughter anymore. I was his partner. And we had just planted a bomb in the foundation of my brother's life, set to detonate the moment he tried to claim a crown that was never his. The waiting game had begun. Grandpa Warren died on a Tuesday morning. Just as the sun was beginning to bleach the gray out of the sky, it was 4 a.m. The house was completely silent. There were no alarms, no panicked shouts, and no dramatic last words. The rhythm of the oxygen machine simply slowed, paused, and then stopped. I was holding his hand. It was just the two of us, exactly as he had wanted. The peace of that moment lasted for exactly 2 hours. Then, the rest of the family woke up, and the circus came to town. My mother arrived at 6:30, already wearing waterproof mascara. She threw herself across the bed, sobbing loudly enough to wake the neighbors, though she hadn't visited him in 3 weeks because she claimed the smell of the medicine made her nauseous. Colton arrived at 7, looking annoyed that death had inconvenienced his gym schedule. He didn't go to the body. He went straight to the desk in the study, checking to see if the laptop was there. It wasn't. I had locked it in the trunk of my car the night before. The funeral, held 4 days later, was less a memorial service and more a networking event for my brother. The church was packed, mostly with people who owed Grandpa money or people who wanted to know who would control the money now. I sat in the front row, feeling numb, wearing a simple black dress that I had owned for 5 years. Next to me, my mother was checking her reflection in the back of a spoon she had pulled from her purse. When it was time for the eulogy, I stood up to go to the podium. I had written a speech about Grandpa's love for fishing, about how he taught me to drive his old truck, about the time he bought a winter coat for a tenant's kid and pretended it was a mistake from Amazon so the father wouldn't feel ashamed. But before I could take a step, Colton was already up there. He adjusted the microphone, smoothed his tie, and launched into a speech that sounded like it had been written by a corporate AI. Warren Harper was a visionary, Colton boomed, his voice projecting to the back of the room. He wasn't just a grandfather, he was a founder. He understood the value of equity. He understood leverage. When I look at the portfolio he built, I don't just see bricks and mortar. I see a legacy of aggressive growth and market dominance. He actually used the words market dominance at a funeral. I remember, Colton continued, wiping a non-existent tear from his eye. When Grandpa and I would sit for hours discussing the future of the estate, he told me, "Colton, you are the one with the vision to take this to the next level," and I promised him, right there, that I would maximize the yield on everything he built. I stared at my hands. It was a lie, a bold, flat-out lie. The only thing Grandpa had ever said to Colton about the estate was to stop parking his BMW on the grass. After the service, at the reception, the vultures began to circle. My Aunt Marla, who we hadn't seen since Christmas of 2018, materialized by the shrimp cocktail. She was wearing a hat with a veil that looked like a birdcage. She cornered me near the punch bowl. "So sad," Marla said, taking a sip of wine. "Just tragic. He was so wealthy, wasn't he? I mean, land rich. I hope he remembered his sister. I have had some terrible luck with my investments lately. Brielle, you know how it is. Family has to look out for family." "I don't know anything about the will, Aunt Marla," I said quietly. "Oh, come on," she whispered, leaning in, her breath smelling of Chardonnay. "You were there every day. Did he mention me? Did he mention the lake house? I always loved that lake house." "He mostly talked about his breathing," I said, and walked away. 3 days later, the summons arrived. It was an email from Colton. The subject line was simply, "Estate Strategy Meeting, Mandatory." The body of the email was brief. "Meeting at Mitchell Hart's office. Tuesday, 10 a.m. Agenda. Transfer of assets and operational roadmap. Attendance required for all beneficiaries." I read it and felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was gone. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my chest, but the anxiety about my family had evaporated. I knew something they didn't. I knew the script they were reading from had already been shredded. I arrived at Mitchell's office 15 minutes early. I decided to dress down. I wore jeans and a gray cable-knit sweater. I didn't put on makeup. I didn't brush my hair into a sleek bun. I looked like Brielle the freelancer. I looked like the person they expected me to be, the one who was there to be told what to do, to be given a check and patted on the head. I didn't need to dress for power. I had the power in my bag. The receptionist led me into the conference room. It was the same room where I had sat so many times, but today it felt different. It felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. 10 minutes later, the door flew open and the royal family entered. Colton walked in first. Of course, he was wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit that cost more than my car. He was carrying a leather briefcase and a Starbucks cup. He looked energized. He looked like a man who was about to cash a lottery ticket he thought he had earned. Kendra was right behind him, clicking away on her heels, carrying a sleek silver laptop. She gave me a tight, pitying smile. "Hey, Brielle," she said. "You look comfortable?" "It's a Tuesday," I said. "Right," she said, setting up her laptop on the table. "Colton has a very busy day, so we are going to try to keep this high level." My mother drifted in last, looking like a tragic widow from a soap opera. She sat down next to Colton, instinctively aligning herself with the perceived source of future income. Aunt Marla was there too, sitting on the edge of her seat, looking nervous. "Where is Mitchell?" Colton asked, checking his watch. "I have a contractor meeting at noon to discuss the renovations on the Elm Street property." I looked up. "Renovations?" "Yes," Colton said, not looking at me. He was arranging his papers. "I'm going to gut the downstairs unit. Open concept. We can double the rent if we get rid of those walls." I knew for a fact that the downstairs unit on Elm Street had a load-bearing wall right down the middle, and if he removed it, the second floor would collapse into the kitchen. But I said nothing. Mitchell entered the room a moment later. He carried nothing but a single file folder. His face was unreadable. He sat at the head of the table and folded his hands. "Good morning," Mitchell said. "Let's get to it," Colton said. Taking charge immediately, he stood up, commanding the room. "I have prepared an agenda. First, I want to review the current valuation of the properties. I have spent the last week auditing the books, and frankly, the mismanagement is shocking." I sat very still. This was it. "Mismanagement?" Mitchell asked, his voice neutral. "Total chaos," Colton said, shaking his head. "Grandpa was letting people live there for pennies. No rent increases in 5 years. Maintenance requests being handled by random handymen instead of licensed vendors. It's a mess. But don't worry, I've been tracking it." He paused for effect, looking around the room to ensure he had everyone's attention. "In fact," Colton said, puffing out his chest, "I have been quietly subsidizing some of the maintenance costs myself over the last 4 years. I didn't want to worry Grandpa. So I paid for the roof repairs on the commercial center out of my own pocket. I paid for the HVAC replacement at the apartment complex last summer. I have put about $40,000 of my own money into keeping this estate afloat." My mother gasped. "Oh, Colton, you are a saint. You did that for him?" "I did what had to be done," Colton said humbly. "I knew the estate didn't have the liquidity, so I stepped up. That is why. Mitchell, when we discuss the distribution, I expect that $40,000 to be reimbursed off the top before we split the rest." I looked at him. I looked at his confident jawline, his fake concern, his greedy eyes. My heart started to pound, not with fear, but with the thrill of the catch. He had just claimed he paid for the roof repairs. I knew, for a fact, that the roof repairs on the commercial center were paid for by a check from Grandpa's primary business account on August 12th, 2021. I knew this because I had mailed the check. He had just claimed he paid for the HVAC replacement. I knew, for a fact, that the HVAC was never replaced. We had it repaired by a local technician named Dave for $600. I was there when Dave fixed it. Colton wasn't just lying to look good. He was lying to steal. He was claiming debts that didn't exist so he could drain cash from the estate before anyone else got a dime. "So," Mitchell said, looking at Colton over the top of his glasses, "you are stating, for the record, that you personally funded repairs and managed the finances of these properties?" "Absolutely," Colton said. "I have been the de facto manager for years. Grandpa was just the figurehead." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. "You just confessed," I thought. "You just admitted to managing the properties. Which means when the evidence of fraud comes out, you can't blame Grandpa. You just took credit for the crime." "Interesting," Mitchell said. He didn't open his folder. He just looked at Colton. "And you have documentation for these personal expenditures?" "I have spreadsheets," Colton said, tapping his laptop. "I can print them out." "Spreadsheets are not receipts," Mitchell said. "I can get the receipts," Colton snapped, annoyed that he was being questioned. "Look, can we just sign the transfer papers? I am the executor named in the will from 2010. I know the drill. Transfer the titles to me. I will liquidate the assets, pay off the debts, including what is owed to me, and then cut checks to Mom and whoever else." He glanced at me and Marla as if we were charity cases. "I want to make sure Brielle is taken care of," Colton added, his voice dripping with fake benevolence. "Maybe we can set up a small trust for her, so she doesn't spend it all on camera equipment." Kendra laughed. "That is very generous of you, honey." "I try," Colton said. I looked at Mitchell. He gave me the tiniest nod. It was time. "Actually," Mitchell said, his voice cutting through the self-congratulatory atmosphere like a scalpel, "we are not here to transfer the titles to you, Colton." Colton froze. "Excuse me? I am the executor." "You were the executor in the draft will from 10 years ago," Mitchell said. "But that will is no longer relevant." "What do you mean, not relevant?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. "Did he write a new one?" "No," Mitchell said. "He didn't write a new will." Colton let out a sigh of relief. Okay, you scared me for a second. If there is no new will, the old one stands. He didn't write a new will, Mitchell repeated, leaning forward, because there was no estate left to bequeath. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner. What? Colton whispered. The assets were transferred, Mitchell said. All of them, before he died. Transferred to who? Colton demanded, standing up, his face turning red. That is illegal. He wasn't in his right mind. Who did he transfer them to? I took a deep breath. I reached down to my tote bag and pulled out the thick envelope I had been carrying. I placed it on the table. To me, I said, the silence that followed my declaration that Grandpa had transferred the assets to me lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, Colton threw his head back and laughed. It was not a nervous laugh. It was a deep, belly-shaking guffaw of genuine amusement, the kind a father gives a toddler who claims they are going to fly to the moon in a cardboard box. Okay, Colton said, wiping his eyes as he stood up. He didn't even look at me. He looked at Mitchell. She is funny. I forgot she had a sense of humor. That is good. We are going to need levity today. He pushed his chair back with a screech of expensive wood against expensive floor and walked to the head of the table, physically positioning himself in front of Mitchell. He placed his hands on the mahogany surface, leaning forward like a CEO addressing a hostile board, completely ignoring the fact that the actual lawyer had not verified his claim. Let us get back to reality, Colton said, his voice hardening. I have prepared a distribution structure that ensures the longevity of the Harper estate. This is about professional management. We cannot have this portfolio fragmented by emotional decisions or incompetence. He slid a packet of papers toward Mitchell, then one toward Mom, and finally, he tossed one across the table toward me. It landed near my elbow. I didn't touch it. The plan is simple, Colton announced, pacing slightly. I will retain 100% of the voting rights and operational control. I will absorb the liability. I will handle the taxes, the maintenance, and the legal headaches. In exchange for this burden, I will take a management fee of 15% of the gross revenue. Mitchell raised an eyebrow but remained silent. His hands were folded on top of his closed file. He looked like a statue waiting for a pigeon to land. The net profits, Colton continued, gesturing grandly, will be distributed as follows. Mom, you will receive a monthly stipend of $6,000. That covers your house payments and your club dues. You won't have to lift a finger. Oh, Colton, Mom sighed, looking at the paper as if it were a love letter. That is so generous. You really have thought of everything. I try, Mom, Colton said. Aunt Marla, because we know things have been tight. I have allocated a stipend of $2,000 a month for you. It is not a fortune, but it is steady. Marla looked at the paper, then at Colton. Her face fell. 2,000? But Colton, the lake house alone brings in 4,000 a week in the summer. Revenue is not profit, Marla, Colton snapped, his tone sharp. Expenses are high. You should be grateful for the stability. Do you want to manage the septic tank repairs at the lake? No? Then take the 2,000. Marla shut her mouth, shrinking back into her chair. And finally, Colton said, turning his body toward me, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and disdain. Brielle? He paused for dramatic effect. I have thought a lot about you, little sister. I know you struggle. I know the freelance life is unpredictable. And frankly, we all know you are not great with money. Remember when you spent your entire savings on that camera lens? It was an investment, I said calmly. It paid for itself in 2 months. Sure, Colton said, waving his hand. The point is, giving you a lump sum would be irresponsible. It would be like handing a loaded gun to a child. You would blow it on a documentary about sad pigeons or something equally unprofitable. He tapped the paper in front of me. So, under my plan, you will receive a monthly allowance of $1,500. $1,500, I repeated. It was an insult. It was less than minimum wage. However, Colton added, holding up a finger, There is a condition. This allowance is contingent on you attending a financial literacy course. I have picked one out. It is online. You need to send me the certificate of completion, and you will need to submit a quarterly budget to me for review. If I see frivolous spending, I reserve the right to withhold the next month's payment. The room went quiet. The air felt thick, suffocating. He wasn't just cutting me out. He was trying to parent me. He was trying to turn me into his dependent, a child who had to beg for her allowance and show her homework to her big brother. It is for your own good, Brielle. Mom chimed in. Her voice was soft, pleading. You know you aren't like Colton. You don't have the head for numbers. He is just trying to make sure you don't end up destitute. You should say thank you. I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, raised me, and who was now sitting there, nodding in agreement as her son stripped away my dignity. She truly believed it. She believed that because I didn't wear a suit, I was broken. She believed that my kindness was weakness and Colton's greed was strength. You really think that? I said. It wasn't a question. We love you, honey, Mom said. But let's be honest. You can't handle the big things. Colton is the man of the house now. It is his burden. I stood up. I didn't slam the table. I didn't shout. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my sweater. The movement drew their eyes. Colton, I said. My voice was light, almost airy, but it carried a razor's edge. Do you genuinely believe, in your heart of hearts, that Grandpa Warren left everything to you? Colton stopped pacing. He looked at me, a smirk playing on his lips. Of course I do, he said. Who else would he leave it to? You? He laughed again, a short barking sound. Brielle, Grandpa loved you. We know that. But he wasn't stupid. He built an empire. He wouldn't hand the keys to a Ferrari to someone who can barely ride a bike. He knew I was the only one who could keep this ship afloat. He told me 1,000 times that I was the future. He told you what you wanted to hear so you would get out of his room and let him sleep, I said. Colton's smile faltered. Excuse me? He told me what he really thought, I continued, locking eyes with him. He told me you see people as numbers. He told me you would sell the soul of this family for a better tax bracket, and he was right. Look at you. We haven't even read the official documents yet, and you are already acting like you own the oxygen we are breathing. You are already cutting allowances and setting conditions. I am being a leader, Colton shouted, his face flushing red. Something you know nothing about. You are being a tyrant, I said, and you are doing it with money that isn't yours. It is mine. Colton slammed his hand on the table. It is mine by right. I am the eldest. I am the son. I am the one who knows business. I looked at Mitchell. The lawyer hadn't moved. He hadn't touched the papers Colton had distributed. He hadn't corrected Colton's lies. He had simply sat there, watching the performance with the detached interest of a biologist observing a particularly aggressive baboon. But when I looked at him, Mitchell's eyes shifted. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of something sharp in his gaze. It was a signal. He wasn't just waiting, he was loading the gun. I realized then that Mitchell had his own game to play. He had let Colton speak. He had let Colton dig a hole so deep and so wide that there was no way to climb out of it. He had wanted Colton to put his arrogance on the record. He had wanted the allowance plan to be heard by everyone, so that when the hammer came down, nobody could say Colton was a misunderstood victim. Colton was still ranting. I don't have to listen to this. I am the executor. Mitchell, tell her. Tell her to sit down and sign the agreement or she gets nothing. Tell her I can cut her off completely if she disrespects the estate manager. Mitchell finally moved. He reached out and picked up the paper Colton had thrown at me, the one with the $1,500 allowance and the financial literacy requirement. He held it up to the light, as if inspecting a counterfeit bill. This is a fascinating document, Mr. Harper, Mitchell said. His voice was dry, devoid of any warmth. It is a standard stipend agreement, Colton said, puffing his chest out again. It is a testament to your character, Mitchell said. But legally, It has the same weight as a napkin scribbled on by a child. What did you say to me? Colton stepped forward, looming over the seated lawyer. I said, Mitchell replied, dropping the paper onto the table as if it were trash, that you cannot distribute what you do not own. Stop saying that, Colton yelled. I am the heir. Read the will. The will from 2010. It names me. We aren't going to read the will, Mitchell said calmly. Why not? Because, Mitchell said, reaching for his own briefcase, a battered leather bag that had been sitting by his feet. As Ms. Harper correctly stated, the assets were transferred inter vivos, during life, but there is something else you need to see, something that Brielle doesn't even know about yet. I froze. I looked at Mitchell. What didn't I know? Mitchell placed a new file on the table. It wasn't the transfer documents. It was a thick black binder. You see, Mitchell said, looking directly at Colton. While Brielle was learning how to manage the properties, I was conducting a forensic audit of the accounts you claim to be managing. Colton's face went from red to a pale, sickly gray. What? You said earlier that you put $40,000 of your own money into the estate. Mitchell said, You said you managed the books. You put that on the record in front of witnesses. I did, Colton stammered. I did say that. Good, Mitchell said. He opened the black binder. Because that confession just made my job significantly easier. I was worried we would have to prove you were the one who authorized the withdrawals. But you just claimed credit for them. My heart stopped. I looked at the binder. I realized suddenly that this wasn't just about who got the houses. This was about to become a criminal investigation, and Mitchell Hart had just handed Colton the rope he needed to hang himself. The silence in the room following my declaration that Grandpa had left everything to me lasted only a heartbeat before Colton shattered it. He didn't scream. He didn't flip the table. He stood up, adjusted his silk tie, and looked around the room with the weary patience of a kindergarten teacher explaining to a child why they cannot eat crayons. Okay, Colton said, a tight, condescending smile stretching across his face. Okay, I see what is happening here. Grief does strange things to people. Brielle is obviously having a breakdown. She is confused. She thinks her little field trips to the hardware store constitute legal ownership. He leaned over the table, placing his knuckles down on the polished wood, looming over me. Let us be very clear, Colton said, his voice dropping to a register that was meant to be intimidating. There is no world, absolutely zero reality, where Grandpa Warren left his empire to a girl who cannot even afford a down payment on a Honda Civic. It does not exist. He straightened up and spread his arms wide, encompassing the room, the view of the city, and the imaginary kingdom he believed he ruled. I am the only one who knows how this machine works, he proclaimed. I am the only one with the financial literacy to keep it running. The responsible one takes it all. That is the law of nature. So let's stop this charade. Everything is mine. The words hung in the air. Everything is mine. It was the sentence I had been waiting for. It was the peak of the mountain he had climbed, and he had no idea there was no ground beneath his feet. Mitchell Hart stood up. He didn't move fast. He moved with the slow, terrifying inevitability of a glacier. He pushed his chair back and stood to his full height. He didn't look at Colton. He looked down at the black binder he had placed on the table. That is a very interesting perspective, Mr. Harper, Mitchell said. His voice was not loud, but it had a timbre that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It is interesting because it is entirely fictional. Colton rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. Mitchell, don't entertain her delusions. Just pull out the 2010 will so we can sign the papers. There are no papers to sign, Mitchell said. The transfer of ownership is not a future event. Colton, it is a past event. The papers were finalized, notarized, and filed with the county clerk. Mitchell opened the file folder he had been guarding. He flipped it open to reveal a document with a bright blue stamp on the top right corner. The deed to the Elm Street duplex, Mitchell read calmly, transferred to the Harper Trust. Brielle Harper as sole trustee. Date of filing, 3 weeks ago. He flipped the page. The sound of the paper turning was like a whip crack. The commercial strip on 4th Avenue, transferred, date of filing, 3 weeks ago. He flipped again. The apartment complex, the land in the county, the primary residence, all transferred, all filed, all legal. My mother, Diane, made a sound like a balloon losing air. Her face, usually flushed with the excitement of proximity to money, went stark white. Her hand flew to her throat. "No," she whispered. "That is not possible. Warren wouldn't do that. He knew Colton was the favorite. He knew Colton was the business one." "He knew exactly who Colton was," Mitchell said. "That is why he did it." Colton was staring at the documents. His mouth was opening and closing, but no sound was coming out. He looked like a fish on a dock. The arrogance was draining out of him, replaced by a raw, naked panic. You can't," Colton stammered. He looked at Mitchell, then at the papers, then back at Mitchell. "You are the family lawyer. You are supposed to protect the estate. How could you let him do this? I manage these properties. I have been managing them for years. You know that." Mitchell looked at Colton over the rim of his glasses. The look was withering. "You manage them?" Mitchell asked. "Is that what you call it?" "Yes," Colton shouted, his voice cracking. "I have the spreadsheets. I have the records. I have been running the show. How could you file transfer papers without consulting the estate manager?" "I didn't consult you," Mitchell said, his voice dropping an octave, "because you don't manage anything. Colton, you never have." "I have the files," Colton screamed, pointing at his laptop. "I have the deeds on my hard drive." "You have photographs," Mitchell said. "You have scans. You have photocopies." He leaned in closer to Colton. "Tell me, Mr. Harper, how exactly do you manage a property empire using fake papers?" The room went so cold it felt like the windows had blown out. "Fake!" Aunt Marla stood up so fast her chair tipped over backward with a loud crash. "What do you mean, fake? Colton told us he had full power of attorney. He told us he was already on the deeds." "He lied," Mitchell said simply. Colton's face twisted. "I didn't lie. I was preparing. I was getting everything ready for the transition. I did the work." "You did nothing," I said. I hadn't moved. I was still sitting in my chair, my hands resting on the table. I hadn't opened my envelope yet. The thick packet of receipts, the log of my hours, the notes from the tenants. I kept it sealed. I didn't need it yet. Watching them implode was enough for now. "Shut up, Brielle." Colton spun on me. "You poisoned him. You sat by his bed and whispered poison in his ear until he signed over the inheritance to you. This is undue influence. I will sue you. I will drag you to court, and I will prove that you manipulated a dying man." "You can try," Mitchell said, "but we have a video recording of the signing, witnessed by Dr. Evans, who certified Warren's competency. We have 3 witnesses, and we have Warren's own statement." "I don't care," Colton yelled. He was sweating now, beads of perspiration rolling down his forehead. "I have rights. I put my own money into those buildings. You heard me? I said it on the record. I put $40,000 into repairs. That gives me an equitable interest. You can't just steal my investment." Mitchell smiled. It was a terrifying smile. It was the smile of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. "Ah, yes," Mitchell said. "The $40,000. He reached for the black binder again. He tapped the cover with his index finger. "That brings us to the part of the meeting that I find truly fascinating," Mitchell said. "You see, Colton, there is something far worse than having a delusional belief that you own a house." Colton froze. "What are you talking about?" Mitchell opened the binder. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a bank statement. "Worse than the delusion of ownership," Mitchell said, sliding the paper across the table until it rested directly in front of Colton, "is the reality of criminal fraud." "Fraud?" Mom squeaked. "Colton? No, my Colton is a businessman." "Your Colton," Mitchell said, not taking his eyes off my brother, "is a thief." Colton looked down at the paper. I could see his eyes darting across the lines. I knew what he was seeing. I knew because I had helped Mitchell find it. "We audited the accounts, Colton," Mitchell said softly. "The real accounts, not the ones you mocked up on your laptop. We found the invoices you submitted to Grandpa for consulting fees. We found the withdrawals you made using the limited power of attorney you bullied him into signing 3 years ago, the one that was supposed to be for emergency medical expenses only." Mitchell pointed to a line on the statement. $5,000 to a shell company in Delaware on June 4th. $3,000 to a contractor that shares an address with your college roommate. $8,000 for materials that were never purchased. Colton's hands started to shake. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. Those were legitimate expenses," he rasped. "Consulting, strategy. I was working." "You were stealing," Mitchell said. "And the $40,000 you just claimed you put into the estate? That was the final nail in your coffin, son. You just admitted to a financial relationship with the properties. You admitted to commingling funds. You tried to claim you were a savior, but all you did was prove you were skimming off the top." Aunt Marla slowly backed away from the table, as if Colton were contagious. I didn't know," she stammered. "I just wanted my $2,000 a month. I didn't know he was stealing." "He wasn't just stealing money," Mitchell said, his voice hard as iron. "He was stealing the equity. He was leveraging the properties to cover his own gambling debts. We found the liens. Colton. We know about the marker at the casino in St. Louis." Colton looked up. His face was a mask of pure terror. The confident, arrogant king was gone. In his place was a frightened little boy who had been caught with his hand in the jar. Except the jar was worth millions, and the punishment wasn't a timeout. "I can explain," Colton whispered. "I was going to pay it back. Once the transfer happened, once I got the liquid cash, I was going to balance the books. It was a bridge loan. That's all it was." "It is called embezzlement," Mitchell said, "and it is a felony." I sat there, watching him crumble. I could have felt pity. He was my brother. We had played in the sandbox together, but then I remembered the way he had looked at me when he offered me an allowance of $1,500. I remembered the way he had ignored Grandpa's calls. I remembered the way he had looked at the family home and seen only a dollar sign. I looked at my envelope, the real evidence of my work, the proof that I had built, while he had destroyed. I kept it on the table. I didn't open it. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The defense rested. Now, we were moving to the sentencing phase. "So," Mitchell said, closing the binder with a finality that echoed in the silent room, "we have 2 options here. Colton, option A involves the police, who are very interested in white-collar crime these days. Option B involves you sitting down, shutting up, and listening to the terms of your surrender." Colton collapsed into his chair. He didn't look at Mom. He didn't look at Kendra. He looked at the table, his eyes wide and vacant. "I'm listening," he whispered. The conference room had transformed into an operating theater, and Mitchell Hart was the surgeon dissecting my brother's life with cold, clinical precision. He did not shout. He did not pound the table. He simply reached into his black binder and began to lay pieces of paper onto the mahogany surface, dealing them out like tarot cards that all predicted the same grim future. "Let us look at Exhibit A," Mitchell said. He slid a glossy invoice across the table toward Colton. "This is an invoice for $12,500, Mitchell said. "Dated October 14th of last year. It is for a complete roof replacement on the rental property on Sycamore Street. The vendor listed is Apex Roofing and Siding." Colton wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip. "So, the roof needed fixing. I authorized it. That is what a manager does." "The roof on Sycamore Street was never replaced," I said, speaking up from my corner. "It was patched. I was there. I held the ladder for the handyman. It cost $400 for materials and labor." "You are lying," Colton snapped. "You don't know what you are looking at." "I am not lying," I said, "and neither is the Secretary of State." Mitchell nodded at me and produced a second document. It was a printout from the state business registry. Apex Roofing and Siding filed for bankruptcy and was formally dissolved in 2018, Mitchell said. That is 4 years before the date on this invoice. Unless you hired a ghost crew to fix a roof that wasn't broken. Mr. Harper, this invoice is a fabrication. You created it on your laptop using a template, printed it, submitted it to yourself, and then wrote a check from Grandpa's account to a shell bank account that you control. Colton opened his mouth, but Mitchell didn't let him speak. He dealt another card. Exhibit B, Mitchell said, an invoice for $8,000 for emergency plumbing services at the commercial center. Vendor, Miller Brothers Plumbing. He slid a photo across the table. It was a picture of an empty lot with weeds growing through the asphalt. This is the address listed for Miller Brothers Plumbing, Mitchell said. It has been a vacant lot since 2015. There is no plumber. Colton, there is only you transferring money to pay off your marker at the casino. The pile of papers grew. Fake electrical work, fake landscaping contracts, consulting fees for market analysis paid to a company registered to Colton's college roommate. It was a mountain of lies, built dollar by dollar, over 4 years. We tallied it up last night, Mitchell said. Do you want to know the total? The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the hard drive in Kendra's laptop. The total amount of unauthorized withdrawals, fake invoices, and embezzlement from the estate of Warren Harper over the last 48 months is $142,650. My mother let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Colton, she whispered, tell me it isn't true. Tell me you didn't steal from your grandfather. Colton looked at the papers. He looked at the undeniable math staring back at him. He couldn't fight the numbers. The numbers were absolute. So he did what cowards always do when they are cornered. He attacked the character of the people holding the evidence. He stood up, kicking his chair back so hard it slammed into the wall. This is a setup, he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. She did this. She poisoned him. Grandpa was sick. Mom, he was on morphine. He didn't know what he was doing. Brielle sat there every day and whispered lies into his ear until he signed whatever she put in front of him. He turned to Mitchell, his eyes wild. You took advantage of a senile old man. Any court in this state will throw those transfer papers out. He wasn't competent. He thought it was 1950. He didn't know he was signing away his legacy to this failure. He gestured at me as if I were a stain on the carpet. She is a wedding photographer, for God's sake. She can't run an estate. Grandpa would never have done this if he were in his right mind. I will contest this. I will sue for undue influence. I will tie this up in probate for 10 years if I have to. Mitchell watched the outburst with an expression of mild boredom. When Colton finally stopped to suck in a breath, Mitchell reached into his briefcase again. I anticipated this reaction, Mitchell said. He pulled out a thick medical file. This is an affidavit from Dr. Evans, a board-certified neurologist, Mitchell said. Dated the morning of the signing, it certifies that Warren Harper was fully oriented to time, place, and person. It certifies that he scored 30 out of 30 on the cognitive assessment. It explicitly states that he was not under the influence of any narcotics that would impair his judgment at the time of the meeting. Mitchell pulled out a USB drive. And this, he said, holding the small silver stick up to the light, is the video recording of the entire session, in high definition. It shows Warren Harper laughing, telling jokes, and explicitly stating his reasons for cutting you out. Colton. He looks into the camera and says, My grandson loves money more than he loves this family, and that is why he cannot be trusted. It is very moving. The judge is going to love it. Colton slumped. The senile old man defense had just been vaporized. But I put money in, Colton whispered, returning to his only lifeline. I did the work. I managed the tenants. Even if I took some fees, I earned them. I was the one dealing with the headaches. No, I said. I spoke softly, but in the devastating silence of the room, my voice carried like a bell. You didn't do the work, Colton. You never did. I reached into my tote bag. I finally pulled out the heavy manila envelope I had been guarding. It was thick, bulging with paper, the corners worn from how many times I had handled it. I placed it on the table. It landed with a heavy, solid thud, the sound of reality crashing into his fantasy. "Open it," I said. Colton stared at the envelope. He didn't move. "Open it," I repeated, harder this time. He reached out with a trembling hand and undid the clasp. He pulled out the stack of papers. They weren't neat. Typed invoices from fake companies. They were handwritten logs. They were receipts from the local hardware store, crumpled and stained with coffee. They were carbon copies of work orders signed by me and the tenants. "Read the first one," I commanded. Colton looked down. "November 12th, he read, his voice barely audible. "Unit 4B, leaking sink, replaced P-trap and sealed drain. Cost, $22. Tenant, Mrs. Higgins." "I fixed that sink," I said. "At 10 o'clock at night, while you were at a wine tasting." "Read the next one," I said. "December 2nd, snow removal, commercial lot, salting and shoveling, 4 hours." "I did that," I said. "My hands were blistered for 3 days. You billed the estate $500 for a snow removal service that doesn't exist. I did it for free because Grandpa asked me to." Colton flipped through the pages, page after page of my handwriting, my work, my sweat equity. "I know every tenant's name," I said, standing up and leaning across the table. "I know which boiler needs to be bled every 2 weeks. I know that Mr. Henderson in the duplex needs a ramp because his wheelchair doesn't fit over the threshold. I know these buildings. Colton, you know the bank account number. That is the difference between us." Colton looked up at me. His face was a mask of shock. He had truly believed I was doing nothing. He had believed his own lie that I was useless. Seeing the proof of my competence didn't just scare him. It shattered his entire worldview. He wasn't the hard-working hero carrying the lazy sister. He was the parasite, and I was the host. He stammered. "You were spying on me." "I was doing the job you were too lazy to do," I said. My mother reached out and took one of the real receipts from the pile. She looked at it. She looked at the timestamp, 3 in the morning. She looked at the note in my handwriting. Tenant was scared. Stayed until heat came back on. She looked at Colton. The adoration that had been in her eyes for 30 years began to curdle. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was anger. But it wasn't a righteous anger. It was the anger of a woman who realizes she has bet her entire identity on a fraud. She had spent years telling everyone how brilliant her son was, how he was the pillar of the family, and now, sitting in front of a lawyer and her failure of a daughter, she was exposed as a fool. "You lied to me," Mom said, her voice shaking. "You told me you were working late. You told me you were handling everything. You made me look down on your sister." "Mom, Colton started. "Shut up," she snapped. It was the first time in my life I had ever heard her raise her voice at him. "You humiliated me." Mitchell cleared his throat. He closed the black binder. "There is one final detail," Mitchell said. "A small matter of timing." He looked at Colton with a gaze that was almost pitying, but not quite. "You asked earlier why I didn't stop you sooner, why I let you file these fake invoices for the last year without saying a word." Colton looked up. "Yeah, why? If you knew, why didn't you stop me?" "Because a pattern is harder to disprove than a single incident," Mitchell said. "If I had caught you a year ago, you would have claimed it was a clerical error. You would have claimed it was a mistake. You would have gotten a slap on the wrist." Mitchell leaned forward. "I needed you to feel comfortable, Colton. I needed you to feel safe. I needed you to think you were getting away with it so you would get greedy. And you did. You got very greedy. You stole enough to cross the threshold into a Class B felony. I didn't just want to fire you as executor. I wanted to make sure that when this day came, you would have absolutely no way out." He paused. "I have been building this case for 14 months. Every time you submitted a fake invoice, I logged it. Every time you transferred money, I tracked it. I didn't say a word. I just waited for the day you would sit in this chair and say, 'Everything is mine.'" Mitchell smiled, a cold, shark-like grin. "Because the moment you claimed ownership of the assets, you also claimed ownership of the crimes committed in their name. You walked right into the cage, locked the door, and handed me the key." The air in the room didn't just feel heavy, it felt pressurized, like the cabin of an airplane rapidly losing altitude. Mitchell Hart placed his hand flat on the black binder, a gesture that signaled the end of the presentation and the beginning of the sentencing. "Now," Mitchell said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "I want everyone to understand the gravity of the situation. We are not talking about a civil dispute. We are not talking about a disagreement over who gets the grandfather clock or the china set. When you falsify invoices to siphon funds from a trust, you are committing fraud. When you use that money to pay off personal gambling debts across state lines, you are inviting federal scrutiny." He looked at my mother, then at Aunt Marla, and finally rested his gaze on Colton. "This is no longer a family matter. Colton, you cannot apologize your way out of this. You cannot hug your mother and make this go away. A crime has been committed against the estate, and as the attorney of record, I have a mandatory reporting obligation." Colton didn't just stand up, he erupted. He shoved his heavy leather chair back with such force that it tipped over and crashed onto the floor, the sound exploding like a gunshot in the quiet room. He looked wild, his hair disheveled, his eyes wide with a frantic, cornered energy. "You did this," he screamed, spinning around to point a shaking finger at me. Spittle flew from his mouth. "You vindictive little witch! You planned this. You sat there in the dark and you plotted to destroy this family. Are you happy now? Are you satisfied?" He looked at Mom, desperate for an ally. "Mom, look at her. She is smiling. She ruined us. She ruined the family name. We are going to be dragged through the mud because she couldn't stand the fact that Grandpa loved me more." I wasn't smiling. My face was stone. I remained seated, my hands folded on top of the blue notebook that Grandpa had given me. The notebook that contained more truth in its first 10 pages than Colton had spoken in his entire life. "I didn't destroy the family, Colton," I said. My voice was low, but it cut through his shouting like a razor through silk. "And I didn't destroy you." "You set me up," he roared. "No," I said. "I just stopped letting you destroy me." Colton froze. For a second, he looked like he was going to lunge across the table. Kendra, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly snapped into action. She grabbed Colton's arm, her fingernails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "Colton, stop," she hissed, her voice trembling. She wasn't looking at him with love. She was looking at him with panic. She was looking at him like he was a sinking life raft she was terrified to be strapped to. "Sit down. You are making it worse. We need to call a lawyer. A criminal lawyer." "I don't need a lawyer." Colton shook her off. "I am the victim here. They trapped me." "You trapped yourself the day you wrote the first fake check," Mitchell said. He checked his watch. "And frankly, the time for histrionics is over." Just then, there was a heavy, authoritative knock at the conference room door. The sound made everyone jump. Aunt Marla let out a small yelp. Mom covered her mouth with her hand. Colton whipped his head around, his eyes darting to the door with primal fear. He expected uniforms. He expected handcuffs. He expected the dramatic, loud entrance of the police to drag him away in front of his weeping mother. But I didn't look at the door. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at my mother. She was sitting there, pale and shaking. On the table in front of her were the 2 piles of paper Mitchell had laid out. On the left was the pile of Colton's lies, the fake invoices, the bank transfers to casinos, the empty shell companies. On the right was my pile, the handwritten logs, the receipts for parts I bought with my own money, the letters from tenants thanking me for fixing their heat in the middle of winter. She was looking at the papers, and then she looked up at me. Her eyes were swimming with tears, but for the first time in 34 years, the fog of favoritism was gone. She wasn't looking at Brielle the failure. She was looking at the only person at the table who had actually loved her father. "Mom," I said softly. She blinked, a tear rolling down her cheek. "Someone is about to walk through that door," I said. "And before they do, I need to know, who are you going to defend this time?" She looked at Colton, who was panting, red-faced, and ugly in his entitlement. Then she looked back at me. She opened her mouth to speak, to perhaps offer one last excuse for her golden boy, but the words died in her throat. She looked down at the receipt where I had spent $22 to fix a sink, and she realized that while she was bragging about Colton to her friends, I was on my knees under a cabinet, doing the work. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob. It wasn't a performance. It was the sound of a mother mourning the living. She didn't say his name. She didn't reach for him. She withdrew. That was my answer. The door opened. It wasn't the police. It wasn't a SWAT team. 2 men and a woman walked in. They were dressed in nondescript gray and navy suits. They carried thin briefcases and wore IDs on lanyards around their necks. They didn't have guns. They didn't have handcuffs. They had something much worse: paperwork. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air smelled of bureaucracy and ruin. Colton took a step back, hitting the wall. Who are you?" The woman in the lead stepped forward. She was about 40, with glasses and a face that looked like it had never smiled in its life. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Mitchell. She looked only at Colton. "Mr. Colton Harper?" she asked. "Yes," he whispered. "I am Special Agent Miller from the State Department of Financial Investigation," she said. Her voice was flat, professional, and utterly terrifying because of it. "We are executing a warrant to freeze the assets associated with your personal accounts and the accounts of the entity known as Harper Management, LLC." She held out a document. Colton didn't take it. She placed it on the table. "This is a court order," she continued, "requiring the immediate surrender of all electronic devices, hard drives, and financial records in your possession. We are also serving you with notice that you are a person of interest in an ongoing investigation regarding wire fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement." "Tax evasion?" Colton squeaked. "You didn't declare the income you siphoned from the estate," Mitchell noted helpfully from his chair. "The IRS tends to frown on that." Colton looked at the agents. He looked at the warrant. This wasn't a dramatic arrest where he could scream and fight and look like a martyr. This was a procedural dismantling of his life. This was the cold, hard machinery of the law grinding into gear. "You can't do this," Colton said, but his voice was thin. I have a tea time." It was such a ridiculous thing to say that the female agent actually paused. She looked at him with a mixture of confusion and pity. "Mr. Harper," she said, "I would suggest you cancel your appointments for the foreseeable future. We need your phone, now." Colton stood there, paralyzed. Kendra was the one who moved. She reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and placed it on the table. She pulled her hand back quickly, as if the phone were radioactive. "Kendra?" Colton looked at her, betrayed. "Give them the laptop," Kendra said, her voice shaking. "Give them everything. Colton, don't make them get a search warrant for our house. Please." She was already distancing herself. She was already calculating how to separate her finances from his. Colton slowly reached into his bag and pulled out the laptop. The same laptop he had used to create the fake invoices. The same laptop he had used to check his gambling stats while Grandpa was dying. He handed it to the agent. "This isn't over," Colton muttered, trying to summon one last scrap of bravado. He looked at me. "You think you won? You just invited the government into our lives. They will audit everything. They will audit you too." "Let them," I said. "My books are clean. I used a notebook. You used a spreadsheet to lie." The agent handed Colton a receipt for his devices. "Mr. Harper, do not leave the city. Do not attempt to access your bank accounts. They are currently locked. We will be in touch to schedule a formal interview." She turned to Mitchell. "Mr. Hart, thank you for your cooperation. We will take the evidence binder now." Mitchell handed over the black binder. the work of 14 months, the trap he had baited and waited patiently for Colton to walk into. "Pleasure doing business with you," Mitchell said. The agents turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind them. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It wasn't the silence of anticipation, it was the silence of a funeral. Colton stood by the wall, stripped of his phone, his laptop, his money, and his dignity. He looked small. The expensive suit suddenly looked like a costume he was wearing for a play that had been canceled. He looked at Mom, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. She was staring at the table, twisting a tissue in her hands. He looked at Kendra, but she was staring out the window, her arms crossed tight across her chest. Finally, he looked at me. For the first time in my life, I saw him really see me. He didn't see the little sister he could bully. He didn't see the failure he could mock. He saw the person who had outmaneuvered him at every turn. He saw the person who held the keys, literally and figuratively. "You planned this," he whispered. "You knew all along." "I didn't plan for you to be a thief, Colton," I said. "You did that all on your own. I just turned on the lights." He looked at the empty spot on the table where his laptop used to be. He realized then that this wasn't just a bad meeting. This was the end of his life as he knew it. The country club membership, the leased cars, the respect of his peers, the narrative of the successful businessman, it was all gone. He wasn't the heir anymore. He was a suspect. And the worst part for him wasn't the fear of jail. It was the realization that the sister he had underestimated was the one who had opened the gate and let the wolves in. "I think we are done here," Mitchell said, standing up. "Brielle, if you would stay behind. We have some transfer documents to sign regarding the new management structure. Colton, Kendra, Marla, Diane. The exit is behind you." Colton didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, painfully, he pushed himself off the wall. He walked toward the door. He didn't look back. He walked like an old man, burdened by a weight he had never expected to carry. The weight of consequences. This was a one-way door, and he had just stepped through it. The room was suspended in a state of suspended animation. The agents were organizing the seized electronics, stacking Colton's life into plastic evidence bags. My brother stood by the wall, a hollow shell of the man who had walked in here 40 minutes ago. He looked like a building that had been imploded from the inside. The facade was still standing, but the structural integrity was gone. But I wasn't done. There was one last thing that needed to be said, not by me, but by the man whose legacy they had tried to butcher. "Mitchell," I said, my voice cutting through the low murmur of the agents. "The letter?" Colton's head snapped up. "What letter?" Mitchell stopped packing his briefcase. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew the cream-colored envelope Grandpa had given him the night of the signing. The wax seal, stamped with Grandpa's initials, was still unbroken. "Grandpa Warren left a specific instruction," I said, looking at my mother. "He said this letter was only to be read during the estate meeting. He said it was the final word." "I don't want to hear it," Colton muttered, staring at the floor. "I have heard enough." "You will hear it," Mitchell said. He didn't ask. He commanded. He broke the wax seal with a sharp snap. He unfolded the heavy stationery. The rustle of the paper was the only sound in the room. Even the federal agents paused in their work, sensing that they were witnessing the final act of a tragedy. Mitchell adjusted his glasses and began to read. Grandpa's voice filled the room, not frail and wheezing as it had been in the end, but strong and clear through Mitchell's steady baritone. "To my family," Mitchell read, "if you are hearing this, it means I am gone. It also means that we are sitting in a room where my grandson, Colton, has just tried to claim that he owns everything." Colton flinched as if he had been struck. My mother let out a gasp. It was like a ghost had walked into the room. "I am writing this because I know my grandson." The letter continued. "I know that he looks at my buildings and sees only the equity. I know that he looks at my tenants and sees only obstacles to higher rent. I have watched him for years. I have watched him ignore the leaking roofs, because they didn't affect his bonus. I have watched him treat this family like a corporation where he is the CEO and everyone else is an expense to be minimized. Mom was weeping now, her face buried in her hands. The truth was being read into the record, and there was no way to deny it. I chose Brielle, Mitchell read, not because she is my granddaughter, but because she is the only one of you who understands what a home is. She looks at a duplex and sees a shelter for a family. Colton looks at a duplex and sees a line item. You cannot build a legacy on greed. You can only build it on care. Brielle has the care, therefore, she gets the burden and the glory of the work. Then came the part that made the air leave the room. Mitchell paused. He looked directly at Colton, then back at the page. I have also given Mitchell a specific instruction, the letter said. I know that Colton will not accept this. I know he will try to produce documents. I know he will try to claim he managed the estate. I have seen the way he looks at the files when he thinks I'm asleep. Colton's face went white. Grandpa had known. He had seen everything. Therefore, Mitchell read, emphasizing every word, if anyone in this meeting presents false documentation or attempts to claim ownership based on work they did not do, or submits invoices for money they did not spend, Mitchell is instructed to immediately turn over all evidence of this fraud to the State Department of Financial Investigation. I will not have my legacy stolen by a thief, even if that thief shares my last name. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the trap. The trap had not been set by Mitchell. It had not been set by me. It had been set by Grandpa Warren. He knew Colton so well. He understood his greed so completely that he had predicted the crime before it happened. He had weaponized his own will to ensure that justice would be served from beyond the grave. He knew, Colton whispered. He set me up. He didn't set you up, I said. He just gave you a choice. You could have come in here today and been honest. You could have admitted you didn't do the work. If you had done that, the letter would have stayed sealed. You would have walked away with nothing, but you would have walked away free. But Grandpa knew you couldn't do it. He knew you were too arrogant to tell the truth. He was sick, Colton screamed, his voice cracking, desperate to find a villain that wasn't himself. You manipulated him. You made him write that. That isn't him talking. That is you. Colton, Mitchell said, closing the letter. We have the video of him dictating this letter. We have the doctor's note. We have the witnesses. The more you scream, the more you prove him right. I reached into my envelope one last time. There was one single sheet of paper left. You want to see something that isn't manipulation? I asked. I slid the final page across the table. It stopped right in front of him. It was a copy of the transfer deed for the main estate. At the bottom was Grandpa's signature. It wasn't the shaky, weak scrawl of a dying man. It was bold. It was firm. It was the signature of a man who was making the most important decision of his life. Next to the signature, in Grandpa's distinct handwriting, was a note he had penned right before he put the pen down. Not a promise, a signature. He used to tell us that, remember? I said, looking at Colton. When we were kids, he said people make promises because they intend to break them. Businessmen make signatures because they intend to keep them. This is his signature. Colton. It is iron, and you broke yourself against it. My mother looked at the paper. She looked at the handwriting she had known her entire life. The reality finally settled over her. She had spent her life betting on Colton. She had invested her emotional capital, her pride, and her identity in the idea that he was the success story. And now, she was sitting in the wreckage of that investment. She had lost her father, and effectively, she had lost her son. And looking at me, she realized she had lost her daughter a long time ago. Brielle, Mom said, her voice trembling. She reached a hand out across the table, palm up, a peace offering, a plea for connection. Honey, I didn't know. I am so sorry. We can fix this. We are still family. I looked at her hand. It was manicured, perfect, and empty. No, Mom, I said. We can't fix this. But I am your mother, she sobbed. And he was your father, I said, pointing to the letter. "And you sat there and let Colton call him senile. You sat there and let Colton call him a fool. You didn't defend him. You defended the money. You made your choice." I stood up. I didn't take her hand. Aunt Marla, seeing the ship sinking, tried to grab a life vest. "Brielle," she said, her voice high and pitchy, "about the stipend. I know Colton was, well, he was unfair, but surely you won't cut family off? I mean, I have bills, the lake house." I turned to her. My gaze was cold enough to freeze the water she was so worried about. "There is no stipend, Marla," I said. "The gravy train just derailed. If you want to be part of my life, you are welcome, but you will be part of it as a person, not a dependent. Anyone who wants to stay in my life must stay by virtue of their kindness, not their demands. The Bank of Harper is closed." Marla shut her mouth with an audible click. The female agent stepped forward. She placed a clipboard in front of Colton. "Mr. Harper," she said, "I need you to sign the inventory list of seized items, and then I need you to vacate the premises. We will be freezing the locks on your office within the hour." Colton looked at the clipboard. He picked up the pen. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely form the letters. He signed his name, the name that used to open doors, the name that used to command respect, on a document that marked the beginning of his end. He looked up. He looked past the agents, past his weeping mother, past his terrified wife. He looked at me. His eyes were filled with a strange mixture of hatred and awe. He looked at me like he had never seen me before. For 34 years, he had looked at me and seen a piece of furniture. Now, he looked at me and saw the architect of his downfall. He saw a stranger, a powerful, untouchable stranger. "You really did it," he whispered. "You really took it all." "I didn't take anything," I said. "I just kept it safe." I picked up my tote bag. I picked up the blue notebook. I left the envelope of evidence on the table. The agents would need it more than I did. "You can have the words, Colton," I said, my voice steady and final. "You can have the speeches, and the promises, and the lies. I will keep the signature." I turned around. I didn't say goodbye to my mother. I didn't say goodbye to the aunt who only loved my wallet. I walked toward the heavy oak door. I pushed it open and stepped out into the hallway. The air out there was cool and fresh. It didn't smell of old money and betrayal. It smelled of freedom. I heard the door click shut behind me. It was a solid sound, a final sound. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind that door that belonged to me anymore. My future was waiting outside, and for the first time in my life, it was entirely, completely mine. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It was a long journey from the corner of that conference room to the final signature, and I hope you enjoyed seeing justice served as much as I enjoyed writing it. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening from a coffee shop in London, a commute in New York, or maybe relaxing at home in Sydney? Let me know in the comments below. I love reading about where our community is from. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of karma and revenge, please make sure to subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories. Don't forget to hit the like button and smash that hype button to help this story get recommended to more people who need a little satisfaction in their day. Your support means the world to me. See you in the next story.